a risk index that he's developed. We'll start at about 5 after, so make yourself comfortable, and we'll get started in just a little bit. And today will be available for management webinar. Today I'm joined by David Levy from MIT, one of the leading experts on this topic and the person I admire greatly. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes, so relax, and we'll get started at about 5 after. Management webinar on risk management, and we're excited to have people coming in. So we're going to give it just a couple more minutes, and then we're going to get started. This is Lora Cecere with Supply Chain Insights. Good afternoon. This is Lora Cecere with Supply Chain Insights. And today we're going to be talking about supply chain risk management. We're joined by over 100 people on this topic as people really want to understand what's happening with risk management. Volatility's increased, supply chains are more fragile, and people want to know what to do about it. This is one of our ongoing webinars that we have to help people to get some insights from research and different points of view on topics. On these webinars, which we have twice a month, we invite speakers to come and comment on the research that we're doing and also share their research and their point of view. My name is Lora Cecere, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights. And today I'm joined by David Levy. And I got to say, when I think about supply chain risk management, I think of David. I first started researching supply chain risk management about 6 years ago as an analyst, and David was one of the first people that I talked to about it and one of the most insightful. And David is a professor of engineering at MIT, and he's also now the chairman of a company called Ops Rules, and it's a management consulting company, and they focus also on strategy. And, you know, no doubt about it, he's one of the thought leaders in supply chain management, and he's focused on looking at robust and efficient techniques for logistics and manufacturing systems. He's one of the few people that I know that's well-grounded in both academic areas and also the evolution of technology, and he publishes widely in professional journals on both practical and theoretical aspects of supply chain management. He's also co-authored the book, Managing the Supply Chain, The Logic of Logistics, Managing the Supply Chain, and he had a new book, Operations Rules, Delivering Customer Value Through Flexible Operations, which was published by the MIT Press in 2011. He consults and collaborates extensively with different companies, and I first met David when he had founded and was running and managing a company called Logic Tools that is now owned by IBM. David, welcome to the webinar. How are you doing today on this beautiful day?
Thanks, Laura. Welcome, everybody. Happy to be with participants. I'm looking forward for the discussion, Laura.
Well, great. David, how long have you been covering risk management? You know, how long has that been a topic for you?
So I'll give you a perspective by looking at my career over the last 25 years. I came to the U.S. 25 years ago for 1 year only, and it has been a very long year. Focusing a lot on the supply chain and operation. As you mentioned, I used to have a software company that I founded in '96 and sold in 2007. The last 5-6 years, I've been focusing more and more on risk management, more and more on operation and supply chain risk mitigation strategies. And what we see now is an explosion of ideas, publications, technologies on this topic.
You know, I first started hearing about the topic about 6 years ago, and I know of no definitive definition of risk management in the industry. Do you have one that you like, or do you know of a definitive risk management definition?
As we go through the discussion, I will share with you some of my thinking about risk management and how I define it, and especially what are the new ideas that exist out there that allow companies to think carefully about risk mitigation strategies, either responding to an event or proactively planning and designing their business.
Great. Well, you know, the more we can define things for the audience, the better, and that's why I love what you've done on the risk index, and you're going to talk about that a little bit today. So from an audience perspective, we're going to divide this conversation into thirds. I'm going to share with you some research that we've done at Supply Chain Insights, which is a piece of quantitative research where we're trying to find out the general trends in risk management and to hear from the voice of the supply chain audience about where they're at in their evolution. I'm going to ask David then to comment a little bit on the findings, and then he's agreed to share his research on risk management, which includes some of his work that he's done with some major companies and also some of the work that he's done around quantifying risk. For the study that I'm going to talk about first, which was a quantitative study, we defined risk management as the proactive identification and assessment of potential risks to the supply chain. And it's important to know that in this quantitative research, which was open research, we defined the supply chain as from the customer's customer to supplier's supplier. So it's a wider definition than just a supply chain function. And we also wanted to understand where are people with the development of strategies to avoid these risks. Now, when we did the study was conducted through open source research methodology, which included soliciting LinkedIn profiles and asking people to fill in the survey. We also went on Twitter and asked people to fill in the survey, and we did some work with our database to ask people to fill in the survey and work some with Supply Chain Brain to get some survey responses. We conducted this recently in the period of February and March, and we wanted to understand, you know, just where we are in this journey. What are the drivers? Did people have disruptions? And, you know, we wanted to look at where are people in terms of their journey. This is the study overview, and I just want to remind you that the slides that we're going to present will be available on SlideShare, and we want you to use our research. So unlike other companies that may want to protect the research and want you to be sure that you have, you know, security around who uses it, we want it to be open for everyone. We want everyone to be able to use this research. So the first thing we wanted to find out is just where in the organization is this responsibility currently focused? And we found that, you know, it could be in a variety of places, but the head of supply chain, the VP of supply chain, particularly when the organization defines supply chain more widely, was often tasked with the topic of supply chain risk management. It also could be associated with a chief operating officer or a CEO or a CFO. And then we get into some more areas that maybe not have the responsibility of strategy or human resources. So 37% of the responsibility is actually the C-level. And one of the things that we're finding is risk management, for a number of reasons, is rising as a supply chain issue at the board level. And I think actually is a good way that people in supply chain organizations that are trying to connect the supply chain initiatives to a higher level can actually engage in a board level discussion. Now, when we look at the what we find in today's supply chain companies, you know, we ask them, you know, how would you describe your supply chain today, right? And you can see up there at the top, you know, we've got a lot of room for improvement, right? We're cautious, we're reactive, we're traditional, we're push, we're inside out, right? And when we get down here into, you know, where we actually have made progress, we are able to have global supply chains now, connectivity and some of the work we've done in technology, and we can now manage many supply chains or multiple supply chains, and they're more controlled than what people felt that they had been in the past. However, when we ask people about risk management and where it falls on the list of objectives, we find that demand supply volatility tops the list, supply chain visibility next, and then cross-functional alignment. We spend a lot of time there, then talent, ability to use data. Those are our top 5 elements of business pain. And down here at the bottom, with 13% saying that that is their top pain, is the area of risk management. However, as we look at the importance of the gap, I question, should it be so low? Because when we look at the gap analysis of, how many people think that it's extremely important versus how people see the performance of their company, we see there's a gap. There's not as much of a gap in risk management as there is in agility, but I think both are because of the fact that we've put most of our energy on creating enterprise systems that are very inflexible, tightly integrated, don't really have the ability to sense. Most of our supply chains respond, but they're not good at sensing. However, most companies that answered this survey had a major supply chain disruption. So if we look at what are the top 3 reasons for risk management being on their agenda, 52% of the companies in the study had a risk management issue, a supply chain disruption, and they could have had a major supplier with a supply chain disruption, so 37%. We also see the evolution of corporate social responsibility rising on the risk management profile. And if you remember, when we did our corporate social responsibility webinar, we found that over 90% of companies had a corporate social responsibility statement. Over 70% of companies actually claimed some kind of marketing claim around how green or sustainable they were. But we only found 22% of companies really owning their end-to-end supply chain, and approximately 60% of non-renewable resources actually lay outside the walls of the enterprise. So there is a corporate social responsibility risk element as well that people are starting to wake up to. So, as we look at the issues, right, and we say how many people in 2013 had a disruption, we found that 80% of companies had a disruption which impacted the financial results, right? And you can see the questions at the bottom of all these surveys so that, if you're going to use the data, just look at the question at the bottom of the survey and it allows you to see what we're comparing. Now, you also can see the number of disruptions that happen per organization, but you don't always find that in the financial reporting. So on average, companies had at least 3 material events, but they were actually not reporting all of those. In fact, only 20% were actually reported in their financial reporting. So what were some of the top disruptions that people saw? Well, the terrible disaster in Japan affected 39% of companies, and Hurricane Sandy was 37%. And then you can see some of the other elements like floods in Thailand, which affected consumer electronics heavily, U.S. government shutdown, which few people had predicted, other natural disasters, the issues in Iceland. And then we also have cyber attacks or computer hacking, which is also on the list and rising on concerns, and it's further down. So these were the top 2 disruptions in the last 5 years for the companies who answered. Now, people see it as very important to supply chain strategy, which I do as well, right? 80% of companies say, absolutely, it's important to supply chain strategy. So let's look at the so what, right? When we look at the current assessment of the supply chain risk picture, or current state today, and we look at 5 years ago versus 5 years in the future, I think this is just a really telling slide. We see areas of consistent high risk, right? And when we look at the data, demand volatility, because we're looking at from the customer's customer to supplier's supplier, has both a very high risk and a consistent high risk factor. And it's one of the areas that I find that people don't know what to do because their supply chains are inside out, they're not outside in. And the redesign of demand systems have to cross over sales and marketing and really challenge the change management issues of supply chain. Now we have areas of decreasing risk, which I think we're starting to do some work around supply chain visibility and product quality. But we also have these areas of increasing risk, which I find very interesting, particularly this issue around operations complexity, which comes to the changing product portfolio, the changing nature of products. Perhaps it's temperature-controlled pharmaceuticals, or perhaps it's composite materials. But we've got a lot happening around the molecules of the supply chain, or the manufacturing processes, or how we manage global operations that are causing us to have higher levels of risk. And also we have a lot of regulatory compliance that's rising in the supply chains as well. And we've got some geopolitical issues, and some of my clients are actually struggling with that because of some of the things that are happening out of Russia. Now, if we look at, the supply chain, so 5 years ago, today, and in 5 years, which was really the base data for the bubble chart that I just showed you, you can see that demand volatility really goes across this as a common theme. But look at the rise in operations complexity and the real core of being able to manage the product life cycle to manufacturing operations and manage it through complex manufacturing suppliers. So what's the answer, right? So first of all, we asked the question of, did you have visibility of your suppliers during a supply chain disruption? And companies, 47% had visibility of their assets and their first-tier suppliers. But one of the issues is they don't have visibility of the extended network. And often we find it could be a second or third tier supplier that may have what we think is an inconsequential kind of part that ends up being a real stumbling block of the supply chain. And what I find is that most companies don't have visibility to where do those second and third tier suppliers have their manufacturing capabilities or their distribution capabilities or their key logistics providers. We also ask questions around, are we monitoring the financial health of our suppliers? And so we found that 82% of companies are monitoring something around financial health of those first-tier suppliers, and 47% monitor most of this, right? Extended tier suppliers, less so. 44% are monitoring the health there. And so financial health monitoring is one of the ways that we can work on mitigating risk. But we also need, as this slide shows, business continuity plans. 48% of companies had a business continuity plan which said when there's a disruption, these are the things we're going to do. And I find that's really critical. And then 39% are engaging in conversations with their suppliers to look at if there's a disruption, these are our plans, this is our process, this is what we're going to do. And 39% of companies have looked at inventory buffers. Now, other techniques, less so, right? Staff awareness training, drills and emergency training, different modes of transportation. So unfortunately, I find that a lot of companies aren't necessarily ready for risk. David, what is your feeling about the research and what's your perspective?
So the results that you showed from your study are consistent with many of the observations, discussions, and research that we have done. There is more emphasis in the market on reactive strategies, a little bit of visibility, some business continuity plans, but there is less emphasis on proactive strategies. Can I look at my entire supply chain and identify hidden risk in the supply chain? Can I change my strategy to increase robustness without increasing cost? This is what I will focus on in the discussion of conquering supply chain risk. And what I will try to do is to convince you that there is a new way of thinking about managing risk in the supply chain. I will start with an introduction and talk about a new concept called the Risk Exposure Index, and then show you how we implemented this concept at a company you know very well, at Ford. Talk about the challenges they face, talk about the strategies that we use, and talk about the impact. On the bottom right-hand side, you see a Harvard Business Review paper that I just published based on the experience at Ford and describing the new methodologies that we here at MIT developed and implemented. And then the second one is a book, as you mentioned, Laura, that I published in 2011 that talks about many of the concepts and strategies around risk mitigation strategies that we have developed. So let me start with an introduction. When you think about risk in the supply chain, you think about many different sources of risks. And I have here just a few examples, and of course there are many more. But you notice that I ordered these sources of risk very carefully. At the top, I have what I call the unknown unknown. These are sources of risk from which we have very little data. Therefore, it's very difficult to control them. Examples include natural disaster, geopolitical risk, epidemics, and the like. At the bottom, I have what I call the known unknown. These are sources of risk from which we have a lot of data. Therefore, we can build models. As a result, we can design strategies and control these types of risk. Examples here include supplier performance, market changes, forecast accuracy, and even execution problems. Controllable or uncontrollable, companies need effective way to manage risk in the supply chain. My experience, very consistent with what Laura described, in her research, is that most companies don't invest a lot in risk mitigation strategies. As you showed, Laura, in one of your slides, it's really at the bottom of the list of areas that they focus on. And even those that focus on risk mitigation strategies, in their mind have a framework like the one that I have on this slide. On the X coordinate, I have the ability to control, from the unknown unknown with low ability to control to the known unknown with high ability to control. And on the Y coordinate, I focus on expected impact. Those companies, and as Laura pointed out, there are not many of them, that focus on risk typically will focus on the known unknown with high expected impact. Why? Because they have data, therefore they can build models. As a result, they can design strategies to deal with the known unknown. Very few, if at all, focus on the unknown unknown with high expected impact. One reason for that is they will argue, look, an event like the tsunami in Japan happens maybe once every 200 years. Very difficult to predict. An event like the volcano eruption in Iceland in 2010 happens maybe once every 100 years. Very difficult to predict. But here is the problem, and this is the point that Laura was making. There are so many of these types of sources of risk. I don't know which one will hit your supply chain, but I know something is going to go wrong. And as a result, the question is there a way to change the way we think about our supply chain, the way we manage a supply chain, so that we design strategies to reduce the impact of disruption? That will be the focus of this talk. And I would like to summarize the introduction by highlighting the challenge. The first challenge, as we pointed out, is very difficult to predict the unknown unknown. The impact can be devastating. Sometimes you hear companies telling you, Yes, we invest a lot in risk mitigation strategy. What we do, we go to every one of our tier 1 suppliers, try to make sure that we are able to measure and reduce risk at each one of our tier 1 suppliers, and maybe we do it with some of tier 2 suppliers. Here is the problem. A company like Ford will have 5,000 plus tier 1 suppliers. If you start working with each one of them, by the time you finish this exercise, the supply chain has changed completely. Other companies will use just intuition, gut feeling, and common sense strategies. And a lot of time what you will find is that this is taking you in the wrong direction. It's taking you in a direction that where risk is not necessarily, exposure to risk is not necessarily very high. Risk is hidden in other unexpected places, and the question is there a systematic way that allow me to identify risk in my supply chain? So let me describe the risk exposure index. I will describe it through an implementation at a high-tech company. And once we understand the key concept, we will go to the Ford case study. So this is a high-tech manufacturing company. They work with a number of contract manufacturers in Asia. They have a few assembly facilities in North America. As you will see in a second, many suppliers all over the world, and they ship their product to their customers through 2 channels, either through distributor or directly to retailers. You can see here on the slide their supply chain. If I move from right to left, you can see the 2 channels. Assembly facilities receive components from distributors and from the contract manufacturer. Many tier 1 suppliers and a large number of tier 2 suppliers. You look at this supply chain and you ask yourself, am I exposed to a lot of risk at the distributors, or should I focus on US suppliers or maybe on the printed circuit board manufacturer? When you look at the supply chain like that, you really have no idea where risk is hidden in this network. One way to start thinking systematically about risk in this supply chain is to focus on 3 new concepts. The first one is what I call time to recovery. Time to recovery is defined as the time it takes to recover to full functionality after a disruption. We talked to the chipset manufacturer, and the chipset manufacturer said, our time to recovery is about 2 weeks. Why? Because we right now provide you with the components from a facility that we have in China. If there is a disruption, we can switch to another facility that we have in Taiwan, and it will take about 2 weeks to move production and ramp up capacity. So time to recovery is 2 weeks. And we collect data on time to recovery associated with different facilities, different suppliers in this supply chain. Once I have information about time to recovery, I can determine what I call financial impact. What is financial impact? Financial impact I define as impact on bottom line. So if you look at this supply chain, impact on the right-hand side, impact on bottom line during time to recovery. So I remove the chipset manufacturer, for example, for a period of 2 weeks, and I try to see what is the impact on revenue, what is the impact on profit, what is the impact on production level during a period of time where the chipset manufacturer is not there. And you can see when I look at impact in this case on revenue, impact was about $400 million. And I can calculate financial impact for each one of the facilities. You realize that this is not very simple, right? I have all the data, but it's not trivial, because when you remove the chipset manufacturer for a period of 2 weeks, the pipeline is still full with inventory. So it's not that once the chipset manufacturer is down, we stop. There is no ability to match supply with demand. We still have inventory in the pipeline. We can still match supply with demand, but for a limited amount of time. And as a result, I can calculate the financial impact. And you can see that I'm doing that facility by facility and realizing for the first time that the distributors are clearly a problem. The financial impact is about $100 million, but they are not as much of a problem as the chipset manufacturer. And in fact, the bottleneck here in this supply chain is the contract manufacturer. This is what I call the risk exposure index, the maximum financial impact over all nodes in the supply chain. Importantly, the KPI, the measure that you want to use, the financial impact or the performance impact that you want to use, depends on the company and the user. In the case of Ford, for example, as you will see later on, we focus on impact on revenue, impact of production capacity, on production level, and impact on profit. Right? But depending on the company, depending on the industry, you may use other additional KPIs. And so let me summarize just the key benefit of using the risk exposure index. First, it provides a dollar measure of risk. It allows us to estimate the cost of risk by looking at the entire network. I'm not focusing on the impact of a disruption just on a specific facility. I'm focusing on the impact of a disruption on the entire supply chain. Second, it completely avoids the need to forecast the unknown. Notice that I have said nothing about the reason for disruption. I am not trying to focus on an earthquake, or I'm not trying to focus on a specific event. I'm just trying to focus on time to recovery and the corresponding financial impact. What we found in one implementation is just discussion about time to recovery allows the company to reduce risk. Why? Because we had similar facilities providing different time to recovery. Well, when we looked at the reason for different time to recovery for different facilities, we realized that if we standardize processes, we can reduce time to recovery, and once you reduce time to recovery, you reduce financial impact. And finally, this approach makes sure that you understand bottlenecks and dependencies in your supply chain. Here is one example. In this case study, where everybody was under the assumption that single sourcing is more risky than dual sourcing strategy. Well, not so fast. Here is one example. One of the suppliers was a single source supplier. So the supplier came back and said, time to recovery is 3 days. How is it possible that it's 3 days? Well, the supplier said, right now I'm providing you with component from a facility in Mexico. If there is a problem, I can switch to another facility that I have in Brazil. It takes me about 3 days to switch production and start providing you items from the facility in Brazil. On the other hand, we had one component where the company was using dual sourcing strategies. There were 2 tier 1 suppliers capable of providing the same component. What the company did not know was that these 2 tier 1 suppliers were using the same tier 2 supplier, and if this tier 2 supplier is down, both tier 1 suppliers will be down. And this is what the systematic approach provides. And so this leads to the discussion of the Ford case study, where, as you will see in a few minutes, I used the risk exposure index and the method that we developed not only to identify hidden risk in the supply chain, but also to develop mitigation strategies, in particular focusing on supplier segmentation. So a little bit about the company operating in more than 200 markets. The model that we developed includes all their products. The initial implementation, as you will see in this slide, involved all their assembly facilities, assembly plant in North America. But the supply chain for the assembly plant in North America is global. Some suppliers are in Latin America, some suppliers are in Europe, some suppliers are in Asia. And we looked at multi-tier supply chain. Here I'm looking at 3 tiers. At the end, when we completed our work, the number of tiers that we include in the model varies from 5 to 10, depending on the specific. And so you can see the entire supply chain extremely complex. If you think about the automotive industry and you think about supply chain, clearly you see many challenges, and I'm listing some of the challenges here. It's a multi-tier network, complex bill of material. Many components are shared across multiple products. We had around 5,000 tier 1 suppliers, and in the model we included more than 50,000 different parts. We incorporated two different types of information about time to recovery. One in which the supplier facility is down, and the other one is not only supplier facility is down, but also toolings are down, which means that time to recovery is significantly longer. So remember I said about 5,000 tier 1 suppliers? Well, the analysis tells you immediately, the risk exposure index tells you immediately is that about half of them, half of the supplier sites pose no risk on the manufacturer, on the OEM. Another about 800, very low risk. But there are 2% of the suppliers that impose huge risk on Ford. About, you can see here, 94 suppliers. You may ask yourself, who are these suppliers? Who are these suppliers that impose huge risk on Ford? Are these suppliers, as the intuition was at the beginning of the project, are these suppliers the suppliers where total spend is very high, or are these other suppliers? Well, let's look. If you look at this slide, on the Y coordinate, I'm focusing on total spend by supplier site. And on the X coordinate, I'm focusing on financial impact. In this case, we will see a different one in a second, but in this case, I measure financial impact by the number of vehicles affected. As you can see, there are a number of supplier sites where total spend is very small, but financial impact is huge. This is what I refer to as hidden risk in the supply chain. And in fact, if instead of focusing on the number of vehicles affected, I focus on impact on profit, so it's really impact on bottom line, you can see that I have many suppliers where total spend is very small, but financial impact is huge. That's why risk is hidden in the supply chain. That's why it's important to do a systematic analysis as you think about risk mitigation strategies in the supply chain. My experience is that most companies that think about risk typically will focus on suppliers where total spend is very high. If you look at this graph, it suggests that indeed there are 2% of the suppliers where spend is low, but exposure to risk for Ford is extremely high. Let's take a couple of examples just to illustrate the insight. Think about suppliers of O-ring. O-ring cost 50 cents, 60 cents, 70 cents. Total spend is very small. But if supply is disrupted, you have to stop the production line. Think about a supplier of valves. A valve may cost $6, $7, less than $10 per piece. So spend with these suppliers is relatively small. But again, if supply is disrupted, you have to stop the production line. And so we develop a segmentation strategy where, just for illustration, I am splitting all the suppliers here into three categories, and I'm developing we develop new strategies for each one of them. Let me show the different strategies. When you think about suppliers at the bottom right-hand side, these are suppliers where spend is small, but financial impact is very high. Here, for some of them, we require more inventory, for some, dual sourcing. But look at what I'm saying. In some cases, we change product design strategy. You ask yourself, how can the change in product design strategy affect this supply chain? Well, what you want to do is to standardize components so that you can give more volume to this supplier, and as a result, Ford is in a much better position to require the supplier to have multiple sites. At the top right-hand side, you can see strategic suppliers. Here, Ford is in a very good position to require some of these suppliers to have multiple sites. And at the left-hand side, we have suppliers. On the left-hand side, we have suppliers where there is some risk, but it's not, of course, as high as the other suppliers. Here, it's about contract. Here, it's about tracking inventory. And what we develop is a dashboard or a control tower that allow decision makers to monitor inventory in the pipeline, inventory in the supply chain. And when inventory goes below a certain level, it sends a red flag because it means that risk has exceeded a certain threshold. And so, as you can see, this is both for planning, this is for proactive strategies, but also this type of technology, this type of concept, this type of approach helps companies change their strategy as there is a change in inventory flows in their supply chain. And in addition, it allows you to allocate resources effectively once there is a disruption, because once there is a disruption, the optimization model, the system that we develop, enable an effective allocation of resources between, for example, different products, depending, in case of one of our partners, depending on product margins. And so let me summarize the impact. We developed an optimization model that identified at-risk suppliers, and as I try to argue, these are not necessarily suppliers where total spend is very high. Some suppliers, typically strategic, requires to have alternate sites. In some cases, the company changed product design strategy, and Ford developed a system to track inventory on a daily basis. Let me summarize the key concept. When you think about risk, I like to say that either you invest now or you will pay later, and there is no way out of this equation. You need to think carefully about your supply chain as you think about mitigation strategies. And of course, there are different strategies that you can focus on. Inventory is one, flexibility, supplier segmentation, and the like. I will stop here, Laura, and we can have a discussion with the audience.
I love that. Well, first of all, David, thank you so much for joining us and elevating the topic of risk. I love the risk index because, you know, we don't have a lot of definitions, I find, in this space. And we've got some great questions coming in. So, you know, one question that we've got from New Jersey is, what about control tower? And, you know, David, I'm going to give you my perspective, and I'd love to hear yours. You know, I hear a lot of buzz about control tower, but I don't find a standard definition. And if I look at what you're talking about, which I love the proactive approach, you're really getting into an understanding of the supply chain and really being very proactive. Whereas I see a lot of people are trying to slap a visibility layer on and say that they've got risk management kind of solves their control tower. I don't think it's sufficient. What is your perspective?
So you are hitting on a topic that is close and dear to my heart. The standard way that companies think about control tower is I will just put all my KPIs on some dashboard and we'll see if this can help me improve the way I manage my supply chain and maybe respond to it. I think control towers and dashboards can provide way more than just a summary of KPIs. The way I think about control towers, it allows you to move from KPIs to what I call KPPs. What are KPPs? These are key performance predictor. What will happen to my supply chain if I don't change anything? This is the example that I gave you at Ford. When
Mm-hmm.
Ford implemented control tower or dashboard, I don't think they like to call it control tower, the dashboard, their objective is to understand if inventory in the pipeline for this component goes beyond a certain level, what will be the impact on risk? What will be the impact, the financial impact? What will be the impact on profit? What will be the impact on production? And what will be the impact on revenue? This is the beauty of, in my opinion, a dashboard. It allows you to understand what will happen in your supply chain a few days from now if you not make a change right now. That's different than just a summary of KPI that a lot of control towers provide their users.
Yeah, and to be able to get to the predictor, you got to do the hard work, right? To really look at what is driving the potential risk, right? And I find most people aren't doing that kind of analysis. Is that your perspective as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think your data summarizes very nicely. Risk is at the bottom of the list, but lots of these companies report, that they have been affected.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned 52% have been affected by disruption in their supply chain. This is an imbalance equation. More than 50% of the companies are affected. I think your number was 13% think that this is important. This is not sustainable.
Right. And, it's unknown, right? So let's take our next question. We've got a question around ERP and data, and I don't see that as an answer either, David. I mean, when you talk about proactivity and, I talk about demand visibility and even supply chain visibility and the management of extended network, right? My research is saying that standardized ERP systems help us with the enterprise, but a lot of our risk is really in the network, and we're still very early in the proactive work, the sensing work in the network. And, I don't think the answer to risk management lies in better ERP. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So ERP for me is an essential part of your technology, providing the infrastructure and the data that you need to use, but it's certainly not the solution for risk. When we do work with companies on risk, we use data that the company has from their ERP, data warehouse, other technologies, and they feed the technologies that we develop that allow us to determine the risk exposure, the financial impact. It's just another input that you use when you build a model representing the entire supply chain.
Right.
So your observation and my experience are consistent.
Well, then we have a question from Melvin. He says, would you use the same kind of technique for service, service-based suppliers? I would think the answer there would be yes. Wouldn't your technique apply equally well to service-based suppliers?
I love this question, Laura, because we just finished an implementation at one of the largest service providers in this country. What is the concept that we use? Exactly this concept. So first, anybody who is interested in a short case study that we just finished, send me on the service industry, just send Laura or me an email, you will get the case study. Second, we use this method to determine how much spare part inventory, for example, this provider needs. When we started, the question is, do we have too much strategic inventory or too little strategic inventory? Different people argued in different ways. And what we find, well, it depends on the different parts. But here is a systematic way that allows you to determine where is risk, how much strategic inventory of spare parts you need, and what is the impact and the value to your customers if there is a disruption of your network. Just as a comment without providing more details, this is a service provider in the telecommunication industry.
Yeah, and I think, you know, all service providers, right, whether it's the labor for service or the spare parts, I love your technique because I see it's really applicable to service, and I think we don't do enough work around service supply chains. You know, most people forget about them. So I thought that was a great question as well. It's kind of a softball for you for your case study. And, you know, if you want to contact David directly for his case study, I've got his address online, and I find David to be really responsive. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, David. I just want to encourage people to check out our public training if you want to really get a synopsis of the research, help your teams to understand what's happening. We are continuing to offer complimentary webinars twice a month in the countdown for our global summit. This was one on risk management. Our next one is on supply chain resiliency, and the work was done with Arizona State University on looking at the patterns of operating margin and inventory turns as we continue our march on the development of what we call the supply chain index, which helps us to look at financial ratios and the delivery on supply chain excellence. We'll also be having a session on our research difference, which lists our research pipeline in terms of the research that we're doing, and I encourage you to come and listen to that. And also the interviews that we've done for Metrics That Matter, the book that I'm writing, which will publish in August. And then in June, we'll be covering the digital supply chain, which looks at how can we get these supply chains that just respond to also sense. Now, on the right-hand side, we have all the past webinars that we have on demand, and we'll also be delivering a number of podcasts on these topics as well, which are available on iTunes, which you can listen to on your way to work or, you know, as you jog. We want to make research easy. And don't forget about our annual event in September 2014, where we try to imagine the supply chain of the future, whether it's the Internet of Things or digital manufacturing or risk management or new forms of analytics. This is a chance where we're going to really showcase case studies and supply chain leaders who are taking new technologies, new processes, and challenging the past. We believe we don't have best practices, we have past practices. And we've got to really learn from 30 years of supply chain management to unlearn, to open up our minds to imagine the future. So if you want to contact me, this is how you get a hold of me. And again, I want to thank you, David, for joining us on our webinar series as we try to imagine the future of supply chain management. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.